Hello, my name is Katie Cadwell, and I'm a researcher at the Interdisciplinary Education Group of the Materials Research Science and Engineering Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At some point in your research career, you're probably going to have to give an oral presentation of your research, whether it's just in a research group meeting or in a class or even at a scientific conference. Today I'm going to give you a few tips for keeping your audience interested and engaged while efficiently delivering content and communicating your research. I've prepared a slide presentation which should be in PDF format next to this video that you can download and refer to while I'm talking. Now normally I wouldn't number slides for a presentation, but in this format I have just because it'll make it easier for you to follow along. I'm going to begin with a few illustrations of things that you don't want to do when you're creating your slide presentation. And then I'm going to discuss some techniques that you do want to employ when you're giving an oral presentation. In the past, when I've been asked to critique a practice presentation for a colleague, I generally have two main criticisms of their presentations. The first criticism that I have is that there's just too much going on in any one individual slide. And most commonly, as you can see on page 2 of my presentation, there's too much text in a slide. As illustrated here, you don't want to put too much text on your slides. Lots of text causes your audience to either quit listening to you in favor of just reading your slides, or more likely to quit paying attention altogether when they see all that text up there projected on the wall. It can also make it difficult for your audience to pick out what points are important in a slide if there's lots and lots of text. Additionally, whatever you do, you don't want to just read the text that's on your slide. And if you have a lot of text on your slide, that's probably what you're going to end up doing. If you do have a slide, such as a conclusion slide that tends to be a list of points that you're trying to make, even then you want to make sure that you paraphrase each point instead of just reading it off as you've written it on your slide. This doesn't mean that you can't have any text on your slides. You just want to try to keep it at a minimum so that the text doesn't distract from you, the presenter. And if you're worried about forgetting what you want to say about a particular slide, you can still use key words and phrases on your slide to help remind yourself what it is that you want to say, but all of the details shouldn't be there in the text. So on slide number 2 in my presentation, this is pretty much exactly what you don't want to do. In addition to there often being too much text on a slide, sometimes there's just too much stuff altogether. So if you go to slide number 3 in my presentation, what you see is a very busy slide. There's a lot of figures, there's a lot of text in this slide, and it just makes it, once again, difficult for your audience to pick out what it is that's important in this particular slide that you're presenting to them. Additionally, if you have to put a lot of things on a slide, you might reduce the text size so that it makes it difficult to read, or the graphs may be difficult to read because they're too small. You also want to avoid using fancy graphics or animations, and especially text animations, unless they really add to the content of your slide. So if you have an animation that you've developed that shows how a particular motor component that you've been designing in your research works, that's an example of an animation that's going to add to the content of your presentation. But just having your titles slide across the page from left to right, that doesn't really add anything to your presentation, and it's distracting for your audience. In general, you don't want your slides to be too crowded. If you have white space in a slide, although it might look blank to you, it really helps your audience to see what it is that you want them to see on the slide, and they can pick out what's important. At the same time that you don't want to have too much on a slide, you still have to remember to put all of the important information in the slide. So all of your figures should have the text that's necessary for someone to figure out what's going on in that graph. There should be a title for a graph or a table, and any notations that will allow them to figure out what's going on in that visual, just in case their attention lapses for a moment or two. So to summarize what I've just said, about actually creating your slides, visually, you want to keep your slides simple. You should minimize the text, only have one or two main points that you're trying to make with any particular slide, and go in general for visual simplicity. At the same time, your slides still have to convey the information that you want them to convey. So you should have all the necessary notations with figures and graphs, and you should make sure that your text sizes, your line widths, and the colors that you've chosen for any graphics are going to look appropriate when projected up on a wall. One more thing that I want to say about the creation of slides is that you shouldn't force a title on any particular slide. If you're going to have a title for your slide, it should add information or clarify something in your slide. If you have a lot of trouble coming up with a title for a slide, and for instance, I did on slide number 4 of my presentation, then you probably don't need a title at all on that slide. Additionally, if your title doesn't say anything important about your slide, so if you just are going to label a slide results, then you probably don't need that title either. People are going to understand that it's your results that you're presenting from your verbal explanation. So that's definitely my most frequent complaint when I see someone give a practice presentation, is that their slides are just too complex and they need to be simplified. The second most frequent comment that I have is that there isn't a clear storyline in the presentation that someone's giving. If you want to keep an audience engaged through what, at heart, is really a bunch of dry scientific data, then one way you can do that is by having a well-developed storyline that creates interest and makes your audience wonder, what is it that you're going to tell them next? And this is just a personal preference of mine, but I never like to have a slide that is an outline slide, where you say, first, I'm going to give you the motivation for my research, and then I'm going to give you the background for my research. The storyline for any given research presentation is always going to follow more or less the same format, and that's going to be motivation, background, results, conclusions, future work, and of course acknowledgments, where you acknowledge the people that helped with your research and also your funding agency. And so you don't really have to tell your audience this ahead of time, and it's a boring slide, and because it's always right at the beginning, then they're automatically starting not to pay attention to you. If you have to have an outline slide, it's also usually an indicator that you haven't developed a very easily followed presentation, that your storyline hasn't been well thought out. So when you're trying to create these storylines, what you want to think about is, what's the message that I'm trying to get across with this presentation, and what's the focus that I really want to hone in on? And in order to develop an appropriate story, you want to ask yourself two questions. And the first question is, what's the main point? So what's the point of your entire presentation, and also what's the point of each individual slide that you've included in your presentation? Additionally, you want to ask yourself, who is my audience? You need to know who your audience is going to be in order to make sure that you give both sufficient background for any topics that you're going to talk about, but also so that you can know what kind of language you can use in your presentation. For instance, if you're giving a presentation to a scientific conference, you can probably use a lot more scientific jargon, but if you're giving a presentation to a more public lay audience, then you probably want to steer yourself away from using jargony words. So to kind of give an example of this, when I was doing my thesis work, I worked on the infrared characterization of liquid crystal-based chemical sensors. And I gave several presentations on this work towards the end of my thesis to different audiences. And the first time I gave a very formal presentation of this work was to a sensors crowd. And the main point that I was making for this work was about the effectiveness of this chemical sensor that I developed. And because the audience that I had wasn't necessarily familiar with infrared characterization or liquid crystals, I knew that I had to provide that background information. About a month later, I gave a very similar presentation in front of a different audience, and this audience was very interested in infrared spectroscopy. So even though I was presenting a lot of the same information, I wanted to frame this presentation differently. So first, the main point of my presentation was entirely different. Instead of being about the effectiveness of the sensors, the point that I was trying to get home was more about the characterization that I'd done of these sensors using infrared spectroscopy. And I had to give this audience more of a sensor's background and motivation so that they could understand where my research was coming from. Finally, I presented this work again through a poster at a liquid crystals conference, and I didn't have to give liquid crystal background, or at least not as much, for this poster presentation, but I did have to give infrared and sensor background to my audience. And so again, that really changed the whole storyline and format and background for that particular presentation. In order to maintain the story arc that you've created now, you need to really connect one slide to another. And to do that, you use transitions. So the same way that when you're writing a paper, you use transition sentences between paragraphs, you really need to have transition sentences when you're going from slide to slide. If transitions don't come naturally to you when you're practicing your presentation, then it's worth it to script them out, write them down, and practice them literally until you kind of have a better feeling for the kind of transition you want to make between slides. This will make your entire presentation seem more coherent and logical. It'll make it easier for your audience to follow along with your logical process and then see how you got to the conclusions that you came to. And it may even make it easier for you to remember what it is that you want to say about each slide. So some example transitions could be, after we discovered point number A that I showed you in this slide, we knew that we had to run experiment B, and then you would show the results of experiment B in the next slide. And there are a lot of words that you can use in particular for transitions: because, in contrast, similarly, additionally, recall earlier that I told you. These kinds of things will help link all of your slides together and make your storyline much more obvious to your audience. If you can't make a transition between two slides, then you might want to rethink the organization of your presentation. There might be a more logical order to present your information in. So even after you've developed an interesting storyline and you've populated your presentation with simple and informative slides, of course, you still have to give your presentation. And I could give you a lot of advice on, try not to move around too much, don't use a lot of filler words like and don't overuse your laser pointer, and those are all good tips. But I have to say that my #1 tip for giving a presentation is that you really want to show your audience that you're interested in your work. If you don't have enthusiasm for what you're talking about, then why should your audience? Another good thing to do with your audience is that it's nice to establish eye contact with them. It makes you seem more at ease, and it gets your audience to look back at you. And if they're looking at you, they're more likely to pay attention to you. Of course, you can only keep good eye contact with your audience if you know your presentation pretty well and you don't have to keep looking behind you to see what's up on the screen. The only way to do that is to practice, 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 practice. If you're going to be giving a presentation and you want to do it well in front of an audience, you're probably not going to do it really well the first time you give it. And you want to practice in front of a live audience, not just by yourself in a room, or even worse, only in your head and not out loud at all. You're going to get a lot of good feedback when you practice in front of a live audience, and additionally, you're not going to skip over parts of the presentation that you aren't as comfortable with, which you might do when you're practicing only by yourself. So I hope that some of the tips I've given you today about both the creation of slides for a research presentation and also the presentation of your research in person are helpful to you. Thank you very much.